Tonight, I'm dropping you straight into the mud and marble of the Roman Empire, and not as some pampered patrician or toga-draped senator with a private bath and a slave for every whim. No, you're not Caesar. You're not Cleopatra, and you certainly don't have a golden wreath or a villa with heated floors. You're just you, modern, confused, and maybe a little resentful propelled face, first into a world where the only thing grander than the architecture is the smell of sewage at dawn. Before you get too cozy, go ahead and hit that like button if you appreciate a good dose of historical misery, and drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing who's surviving these journeys from the far corners of the planet. Now, dim your lights, maybe turn on a fan to drown out the real world, and let's stumble headfirst into the relentless daily grind of a Roman nobody. You open your eyes to a chorus of shouts, the squawking of chickens, and a baby wailing somewhere down a corridor that echoes every sound like a guilt-ridden amphitheater. Congratulations. You've just woken up in a Roman insula, the ancient Roman answer to an apartment building. If your idea of an apartment involves creaking wood, cracked plaster, and the ever-present threat of death by spontaneous collapse, picture a vertical labyrinth cobbled together with hope and whatever building material was cheapest that week. You're probably on the 4th floor, which is just high enough to guarantee you're poor, and just low enough that when the ceiling leaks, it's your bed that suffers. Your room is barely large enough to stand in, let alone stretch out. The walls are stone, sweating in the summer, freezing in the winter, and so thin you could probably catch a cold just by listening to your neighbor sneeze. There's no window, just a jagged hole that leaks in air, smoke, and the occasional aggressive pigeon. Your mattress is a lumpy sack of straw infested with lice, and your blanket smells like a sheep that lost its will to live sometime last year. No kitchen, no table, no furniture, just a chipped clay cup, a threadbare tunic, and, if you're lucky, a wooden comb that's seen better centuries. The only thing waiting in the corner is your chamber pod, silently judging you for every decision that led you here. There's no bathroom, not in your room, not in your building, not in your wildest dreams. If you want to empty that chamber pot, you'll have to navigate a staircase so narrow and crooked, it feels like a practical joke, all while balancing a sloshing bucket of last night's regrets. Miss a step, and you might find yourself tumbling down into the morning rush, face first, into a puddle of someone else's poor choices. The walls around you are so paper thin, you can hear your neighbor's entire life story, prayers, coughing, marital arguments, and the sort of sounds that make you wish you had earplugs and selective amnesia. The air, thick with wood smoke, mildew, the tang of unwashed bodies, and the faint aroma of baking bread drifting up from below, is relentless. But you're not invited to breakfast. Vendors fill the street with shouts about the freshest figs and the cheapest fish guts. Somewhere, a centurion is barking orders at someone who's already regretting their existence. You haven't even stepped outside, and you're already sweating, itching, and possibly inhaling a generous serving of lead dust from the ancient plumbing. Welcome to the Roman workday. You're not a gladiator, you're not a senator, you're not even a character in a tragedy. They'd at least give you better lines. You're just another miserable soul packed into a crumbling tenement, praying not to fall through the floor or offend a minor deity before noon. And the day has only just begun. Now, if you thought things might improve, I'm here to shatter those dreams as efficiently as your ceiling collapses after a heavy rain. The first order of business? Your bladder. There's no bathroom, no running water, not even a half-hearted attempt at privacy. Instead, you clutch your chamber pot like it's a sacred relic and shuffle out onto the street in search of the nearest latrina. Rome's public restrooms are the city's answer to a social club, except the only thing on offer is mutual embarrassment and suspicious puddles. You arrive to find a long, cold stone bench with holes carved into it, lined up like an assembly line of shame. Beneath the bench, a shallow trickle of water does its best to carry away the city's collective regrets. You sit, if you dare, and try not to make eye contact with the man beside you, who seems entirely too eager to discuss the price of barley while squatting. There are no doors, no walls, no privacy, just a shared sense of resignation. The man across from you stares, chewing olives with a look that says he's seen too much and cares too little. Welcome to the Roman latrina, where personal space is a foreign concept and dignity is optional. Then comes the pièce de résistance, the tessorium. This is a communal sponge on a stick, soaking in a bucket of vinegar or brine. In theory, everyone rinses it before use. In practice, the sponge has absorbed more secrets, germs, and existential dread than you'd care to imagine. If you're feeling lucky, maybe you brought your own rag. If you're feeling rich, perhaps a clump of moss. But odds are, you're just like everyone else, wielding the battered communal sponge and silently praying the vinegar did its job this time. And don't even think about relieving yourself in an alley to avoid this ordeal. That's a finable offense, and Roman law enforcement is not known for their sense of humor or subtlety. Once you've survived your turn on the bench, you might try to wash your hands. But there's no soap, no proper sink, just a communal basin that's seen more fingers than a marketplace bread store. You give your hands a perfunctory rinse, but let's be honest, you're probably dirtier than when you arrived. Now, you shuffle away from the latrina, a little lighter in spirit and a lot heavier in existential dread. If you're still clinging to the idea that history is glamorous, this is the moment when that fantasy shatters. Rome is not marble and poetry. It's vinegar sponges and forced small talk over a communal trough. You haven't even eaten yet, and you're already contemplating the odds of survival. Breakfast in Rome is less a celebration and more a brief, grim negotiation with hunger. The Romans call it the ientaculum, but don't expect a feast. You get a hunk of stale bread and a cup of wine so watered down it could pass for a health tonic. The bread, panis rusticus, is a dense, chewy relic of yesterday's baking, with a texture somewhere between building material and punishment. It's tough enough to chip a tooth and bland enough to make you question your life choices. If you're lucky, there's a dab of cheese or a stray olive rolling around, but mostly it's just you, and a chunk of bread so dry it should come with a warning label. The wine is weak because even the Romans understood that showing up to work drunk is a bad idea, unless you're a senator. There's no coffee, no eggs, no crispy bacon, and certainly no oat milk lattes, to soften the blow of another day in ancient Rome. With no kitchen in your insula, you eat standing outside, maybe leaning against the fountain, or perched on a dusty step, with other equally miserable citizens gnawing on their breakfast like disillusioned goats. If you have a smear of garum, the infamous fermented fish sauce of Rome, you might try to convince yourself it counts as flavor, though the smell alone is strong enough to knock your appetite sideways. Sometimes you spot a vendor with hot chickpea fritters or honeyed pastries, and for a fleeting moment, hope flickers in your soul. Then you remember your coin pouch contains nothing but lint and disappointment. So, you chew your bread and pretend it's cake, while silently cursing every senator who ever lived. Your breakfast is carbs, disappointment, and just enough calories to make you question whether it's worth walking the 7 miles you'll trudge today in sandals thinner than a modern flip-flop. The day is just beginning, and it's not getting any easier from here. After your breakfast of dry bread and broken dreams, it's time to face the Roman workday, a relentless parade of sweat, noise, and aching joints. Unless you somehow struck it rich or inherited a farm from a dead uncle, you're working, and you're working hard. Your options aren't glamorous. You might be a day laborer, a porter, a potter, a bricklayer, or, if you've truly upset the gods, a sewer cleaner. Rome needs endless roads, aqueducts, and temples, and every stone is hauled by someone just as desperate as you. The workday starts before sunrise, when the city is still cloaked in a haze of wood smoke and dust. The foreman is already awake, barking insults and threats in Latin, waving a stick to encourage the slowest among you. If you're late, you don't just lose a day's pay. You risk a public shaming or, worse, getting fired. In Rome, unemployment is a death sentence dressed up as freedom. Your tools are basic: a battered shovel, a basket for hauling bricks, and hands that will never be clean again. Forget about gloves or helmets. Those haven't been invented yet. You work under the blazing sun, your skin burning, your sandals doing their best impression of a soggy leaf. If you're a craftsman, you're hawking your wares in a crowded marketplace, competing with 100 others selling the same chipped pottery, rough sandals, or scratchy tunics. Price wars are brutal, and if a rich buyer takes a dislike to your face, that's the end of your career for the day. Even the so-called respectable jobs, messenger, scribe, teacher, aren't much better. You're either sprinting through chaotic streets clutching a bundle of scrolls, scratching numbers for someone who'll forget your name by sunset, or trying to convince a gaggle of senators' children that Latin grammar matters. The only perk is that every day you make it home with all your limbs attached is a small victory. Women? They're working too, and often twice as hard. They spin wool, weave cloth, sell vegetables at the market, and run their households while raising children and dodging the ever-present threat of death by childbirth. Multitasking was not invented by Silicon Valley. It was perfected by Roman women who had no choice but to keep the family alive and the creditors at bay. After hours of hauling, shouting, and sweating, you might get a brief break for lunch if your supervisor is in a generous mood or the prefect isn't lurking nearby, eager to impress his superiors. Otherwise, it's back to work, back to the dust, noise, and relentless grind that is survival in the eternal city. Rome may last forever, but your back certainly won't. And that's just the first act of your Roman day, a gauntlet of discomfort, hunger, and humiliation that makes a modern Monday morning look like an all-inclusive spa retreat. If you're still with me, let me know in the comments if you think you'd have lasted more than an hour in this world. Most modern humans would crumble before breakfast. So, you survived the climb down the insular staircase, braved the public latrina, endured breakfast, and started the endless workday without falling into a gutter or getting arrested. That's already more than most people manage before noon in ancient Rome. But don't get cocky. The real challenges are waiting just outside your door, where the streets are alive with noise, filth, and the constant threat of disaster. Stay tuned, because next we'll plunge headlong into the chaos of the Roman streets, the struggle for clean water, the realities of pain, medicine, and, of course, what passes for food in this relentless city. So you've made it through the morning without fainting or being flogged, but the real adventure is just beginning. You've survived the Roman morning without getting trampled, publicly humiliated, or forcibly recruited into some minor civil war. Now comes the real trial, stepping out into the Roman street. I've crossed those ancient paving stones more times than I'd like to remember, and let me tell you, the city's arteries are less scenic promenade, more full-contact obstacle course. The sun climbs up, beating down without mercy, and the city hums with a kind of chaos that feels both timeless and faintly malicious. Forget the postcard images of marble colonnades and togas billowing in the breeze. What you'll really notice is the noise, the stench, and the fact that every inch of ground seems determined to trip you up or knock you down. You're not strolling, you're bracing for impact. Streets in Rome are where the living and the nearly dead collide. Rats scuttle along the curbs, flies swarm anything remotely edible, and dogs, some stray, some only strays in spirit, lounge in the shade until it's time to bark at your ankles. You can't walk 10 paces without dodging a goat, a donkey overloaded with amphorae, or a merchant who's mastered the art of shouting in several languages at once. Kids dart between legs, chasing each other, or fleeing the occasional vendor's slipper. Thieves eye your worn-out belt with the precision of a modern pickpocket, while beggars rattle cups and mutter curses with the casual fluency of someone who's been ignored by emperors and paupers alike. It's Times Square. If Times Square had open sewage, no traffic lights, and every pedestrian was carrying livestock on their way to an argument about cabbage. Ah, infrastructure, Rome's pride and your daily hazard. Yes, the Romans built straight, sturdy roads. Yes, they paved them with care and cunning. But the result, here in the city, is a level, stone-paved channel designed to move not just people or carts, but every bodily fluid and culinary disaster this side of the Tiber. The center of the street is a river of filth, urine, wine, vomit, animal droppings, and the lingering ghost of last night's fish sauce. Step off the raised curb without checking, and you'll baptize your sandal in the holy sludge of Roman public life. It's not just unpleasant, it's a rite of passage. Wagons and carts, by the way, operate on rules best described as none at all. Officially, heavy carts are banned during daylight hours, So drivers just barrel through after dark, racing each other like charioteers with nothing to lose and everything to run over. If you're lucky, you'll only get clipped by a basket or jostled by someone hauling a day's worth of stale bread. If you're unlucky, your last memory will be the sound of wooden wheels and a fishmonger cursing your ancestors. There's no such thing as right of way for pedestrians. The closest you get is a frantic leap onto the curb when you hear hooves behind you. The air attacks your senses too. Smoke pours out of every window as cooks and bakers try to burn their way through another day's rations. Incense drifts from temples, mixing with the less divine aroma of nearby public toilets. Sometimes the breeze carries the unmistakable perfume of a dead animal, left where it fell until someone decides it's more nuisance than omen. If a dog keels over in the forum, odds are someone will just toss a bit of cloth over it and walk away, confident that the gods, or the city's ever-present vermin, will handle the cleanup. And then there are the spectacles. You might be strolling along, minding your own business, when suddenly a spontaneous brawl erupts in front of you, or a group of protesters blocks the street with homemade banners and a talent for dramatic wailing. Politicians love a good parade, which means you could get stuck behind a row of musicians blasting off key fanfare into your face while someone on horseback throws bread or insults at the crowd. You never know if you'll make it to the end of the block or get sidetracked by a street performance featuring a trained monkey in a senator's toga. The Roman street is alive, yes, but it's not rooting for you. Slip on a discarded fig, get caught in the path of an ox cart, or accidentally insult a patrician's favorite parrot, and your day could end abruptly. There's a reason you don't see a lot of Roman memoirs from people who just went out for lentils and came home with a concussion. You sweat, you cough, you curse the gods, and all you really want is something cold to drink. Surely, you think, in a city famed for its aqueducts, refreshment can't be that hard to find. You'd think wrong. Rome's aqueducts are marvels of engineering, sure, and I have watched those arches stretch for miles across sun-bleached hills. But unless you're wealthy enough to live in a domus with a private marble fountain and a household staff to fetch your bathwater, you're sharing the city's bounty with thousands of your closest, least hygienic neighbors. The public fountains are the beating heart of every neighborhood, where locals fill jugs, wash feet, and sometimes dunk a child. Whether for cleanliness or discipline is anyone's guess. Hygiene, as practiced by your average Roman, is equal parts hope and habit. You want to wash up? Head for the baths. The thermae are everywhere, and everyone uses them. Senators, slaves, merchants, musicians, and that one guy who always tries to sell you dubious sausage. It sounds civilized, until you realize you're soaking in water that's already passed through half the city's population. There's no soap, no chlorine, just a tepid stew of sweat, gossip, and the faint aroma of eucalyptus, if you're lucky. The conversation is loud, the politics are heated, and modesty is a foreign concept. You might find yourself elbow to elbow with a baker discussing bread prices, while a farmer cleanses his ears with a stick. It's communal, it's efficient, it's also a microbiologist's fever dream. If you're wondering about how clean this water really is, let's talk pipes. Roman plumbing frequently uses lead. They had the architecture down, but Chemistry? Not so much. Over time, all that lead leaches into the water, delivering unintended gifts, anemia, gout, infertility, and, if you're truly blessed, a slow descent into madness. Indoor plumbing in Rome is a marvel until you start seeing things that aren't there and forgetting your own birthday. I once watched a senator forget his own name at a dinner party, and everyone just nodded, as if this were a sign of deep philosophical contemplation. If you're truly thirsty, you have two choices, neither of them ideal. Drink the water and risk whatever lived upstream, or drink wine, watered down and sipped all day by men, women, and children alike. The logic is simple. The wine is safer than the water, at least most of the time. You might get a gentle buzz, or you might just forget the taste of despair, which is its own kind of survival. I've seen children as young as 6 with goblets in hand, not because they're celebrating, but because the alternative could be dysentery. Cheers to Roman health. Even with water piped into the city, every swallow is a gamble. You might quench your thirst, or you might spend a week regretting your choices. Bathing, drinking, even rinsing your toes becomes a high-stakes game of chance, one that most Romans play with stoic resignation. Enjoy your aqueducts, but don't trust them. That's a time traveler's tip. But Roman life isn't just about dodging disease and tripping over goats. Pain is the constant soundtrack, the ever-present accompaniment to your daily grind. Stub your toe? There's no ice, no painkillers. Just grit your teeth and limp home. If it heals wrong, that's your new walk. Break a bone? Wrap it up in whatever rag you can find and hope for the best. Splinters are more dangerous than they sound. Every scratch is a potential death sentence if infection sets in. The tools are crude, the bandages are dirty, and sympathy is in short supply. Romans weren't big on comfort. There are no ergonomic tools, no soft chairs, no time off for a sore back. Laborers haul bricks and stones until something gives. Soldiers march 20 miles a day with sandals that chew their feet raw. If you're a woman in childbirth, you get a midwife who knows a couple of prayers and maybe a lucky charm. Every ordinary task is a chance to get hurt, and every injury is a test of how much pain you can swallow before the gods decide you've had enough. When it comes to medical care, well, let's just say the Hippocratic Oath hasn't made it to these parts yet. Your doctor is probably also your barber, your neighbor, or the guy who happened to have the sharpest knife. The foundation of Roman medicine is a blend of Greek philosophy, mystical guesswork, and folk remedies that mostly involve plants, smoke, and pure optimism. The body, they believe, is governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you feel off, something is out of balance, and the solution is usually to drain something, preferably you. Bloodletting is the go-to cure for everything from headaches to heartbreak. If you cough, they open a vein. If you're depressed, they let the sadness out through your arm. Surgery is possible, but only if you're willing to stay awake and bite down on a stick while someone cuts into you with tools that haven't seen soap since the Republic. There's no anesthesia, just the hope that you'll pass out before the pain gets too creative. Infection is a likely outcome, and death is always on the guest list. If you've ever wondered why ancient Romans wrote so much poetry about fate, now you know. If you're lucky, your doctor might offer a salve made from honey, garlic, or crushed herbs. If you're less lucky, you get a poultice of ash, animal dung, or something that smells suspiciously like yesterday's lunch. Prescriptions change with the wind, and if nothing works, you're told to sleep in a temple, pray to a healing god, and hope your dreams are more effective than your doctor. If you don't get better, your family lights a candle, and your neighbors start speculating about what kind of omen your lingering cough might be. There's always that one neighbor who claims it's a sign the city is doomed. But then, he says that about everything. It's not that Romans didn't care about health. They just hadn't figured out what worked and what just prolonged your suffering. If you sneeze in Rome, you might get a blessing, or you might get a herbal compress, but you definitely won't get antibiotics. Count yourself lucky. You live in a world where a dose of penicillin doesn't have to be prayed for. As the sun dips and your aches multiply, thoughts turn to food. You're starving, but don't expect a feast of olives, grapes, and roasted meats. This isn't a banquet in the emperor's palace. This is dinner for the average Roman, and that means a bowl of something brown, steaming, and aggressively unappetizing. Forget pizza, pasta, tomatoes, potatoes, chocolate, sugar, or, most tragically, coffee. None of these exist yet. What you get is a porridge of spelt, beans, or lentils, known as pulse. It tastes like damp pebbles, garnished with the memory of an herb. If you're lucky, there's a hint of flavor. If you're not, it's just hot sadness in a bowl. Protein is a luxury. Meat is expensive. And when you do get it, it's often preserved with enough salt to kill a small army or marinated in garum, a fermented fish sauce with the power to clear a room and haunt your dreams. Vegetables might appear if the market was kind, and fruit is usually dried or wilted from the journey. The wealthy dine on bizarre delicacies, roast flamingo, stuffed dormice, or jellyfish in vinegar, mostly to prove how little they care for ordinary flavor. The rest of us make do with what's left after the patricians have had their fill. Wine is the drink of choice, but it's always watered down. Drinking it straight is considered barbaric, but the water you mix it with probably isn't winning any purity awards. So you choose your poison, get tipsy slowly, or roll the dice on intestinal roulette. Dessert, if it exists, means a handful of nuts or dried figs, unless you're observing a fast for one of Rome's many, many gods. Either way, you're not finishing with tiramisu. There are no napkins either. You wipe your hands on a communal rag or let your tunic take the hit, pretending ignorance when someone complains. By the end of the meal, you're full, but not satisfied. Your breath is a blend of garlic, wine, and existential despair. Still, you're fed. And that's no small thing in a city where the rats eat better than most people. Now, all that's left is to face the hazards of the Roman night. Trust me, nighttime in Rome is a beast of its own, a time when the city's appetite for spectacle, justice, and religion comes out to play. After slogging through a relentless day of sweat, fish guts, and the ceaseless aroma of human waste wafting up from the street, you might think you've earned a little peace, maybe something pleasant. a distraction from the fact that your apartment walls are threatening to collapse and the neighbors are arguing over who gets to throw the next chamber pot out the window. But this is Rome, and if there's one thing it excels at, it's spectacle. Forget gentle relaxation. Here, entertainment is designed to stun you into submission and remind you that the only thing thinner than your tunic is the line between distraction and disaster. Welcome to the Colosseum. This is the beating, blood-soaked heart of Roman entertainment, the architectural marvel that doubles as an existential meat grinder. You join a sweaty throng of tens of thousands, squeezed between strangers who haven't bathed since Saturnalia, all waiting for the main event. Gladiators, condemned criminals, and wild animals circle each other on the sand below. Sometimes, the emperor himself decides to spice things up, perhaps with a surprise naval battle, for which the arena is magically flooded, or a dramatic execution, so theatrical you half expect a critic in the front row. Attendance is free, which sounds generous, until you realize it's a political strategy. The state wants your eyes fixed on the carnage, while senators slip new taxes through the back door and quietly redraw the map of the empire. You clap, you cheer, you wince as limbs fly and blood spills. Maybe you're not sure why you're applauding, but everyone else is, and in Rome, the crowd is more dangerous than the lions. If you find yourself recoiling, craving something a little more refined, you might drift toward the amphitheater, seeking a Roman play. Here, you get your choice between tragedies so ponderous you could use them as sleep aids, or bawdy comedies whose biggest joke is someone faking indecency with a sausage while the audience howls. Nuance is not a Roman virtue. Subtlety died somewhere between the opening monologue and the guy in a tunic falling over for laughs. Maybe you're a thrill-seeker at heart. You head for the Circus Maximus, where chariots race neck and neck at breakneck speed. The crowds are wild, the air electric with the scent of horse sweat and cheap wine. There are no safety rails, and the drivers consider helmets an insult. Crashes are frequent, magnificent, and sometimes fatal, which only adds to the excitement. The crowd is here for two things: betting everything they own and watching disaster unfold. Don't shout for the wrong team unless you want to risk a fistfight on the way home. And if you're not drawn to the formal arenas, don't worry. Rome's streets are a never-ending parade of performers and hustlers. Fire-breathers, acrobats, musicians, and philosophers waft through the alleys, vying for your attention or your coin. There's always someone shouting, juggling, or preaching about the end of days. If you wait long enough, the show will change before you even have time to check your purse for missing coins. Beneath all the noise, though, is a calculated madness. Rome doesn't just entertain you, it numbs you. Spectacle isn't a luxury, it's a weapon, wielded to keep the masses docile while the city's machine grinds onward. And if the violence and pageantry aren't enough to dull the ache, well, there's always another jug of sour wine to help you forget what you just witnessed. Now, let's shuffle off the blood-soaked sand and into the shadowy corridors of Roman justice. If you've survived your daily labor, managed not to choke on dinner, and kept your head at the games, you might think the law is on your side. That's adorable. In Rome, justice is less about fairness and more about reminding you that you're expendable. a replaceable cog in a machine that loves order more than empathy. Your legal status rules everything. As a citizen, you enjoy theoretical protections. Flogging is technically off the table unless you manage to annoy someone of high rank, and you're entitled to a proper trial. If you're not a citizen, though, justice arrives in the form of a boot, a branding iron, or a swift, unsentimental execution outside the city walls. Slaves fare worst of all. If a slave murders their master, even if the master was a monster, every slave in the household could be executed just to prove a point. The point being, don't get any ideas. Should you be accused of a crime, don't expect a fair hearing. Trials are theatrical events, a contest of who can summon the most witnesses, bribes, or melodramatic tears. If you have a patron, now's the time to grovel. If not, pray that the judge isn't nursing a hangover or a personal grudge. Punishments are designed as much for spectacle as pain. Thieves might be branded or have their hands maimed. Liars could find their tongues pierced, and fraudsters could wind up flogged or exiled if they're lucky. Annoy the emperor, and you won't see a jail. You'll see death, delivered with all the creative flair Rome can muster. Public punishment is the norm. Crucifixion is especially popular, slow, humiliating, and performed in front of a crowd who cheers with the same vigor they reserved for the morning's gladiator match. It isn't just a Christian story. It's the go-to punishment for rebels, thieves, and anyone the state wants to make an example of. Don't bother looking for sympathetic police. The vigils, Rome's version of firefighters and watchmen, are underpaid, overworked, and usually more interested in bribes than justice. If you're mugged, they'll shrug. If you pay them, they just might help you mug someone else. Laws are carved into stone and recited in the forum, but at the end of the day, they exist to serve the powerful, not you. So, you've survived the streets, dodged the games, and kept your head down in court. Maybe you're hoping for solace in religion, a comforting ritual, a whisper of the divine. Not in Rome. Here, religion is a public performance, a cloud of incense and anxiety woven through every corner of your life. You don't get to pick your gods. They pick you, and there's a god for everything. Door hinges, sewers, mildew, and boundaries. You can't walk a block without passing a shrine. Ignore one, and you're not just being rude, you're tempting fate. When your roof collapses next week, everyone will nod knowingly and mutter that you skipped the proper offering at the last festival. The Roman calendar is a relentless parade of religious festivals. Business halts, animals are sacrificed, and the city fills with the scent of roasting meat and old marble. You show up out of piety, but also out of fear, because if the gods aren't appeased, they'll repay you with plagues, droughts, or a ruined harvest that sends the whole neighborhood into panic mode. Now, let's talk about emperor worship. The state expects you to bow, burn incense, and sing the praises of the emperor, not just as a ruler, but as a living god. If you so much as roll your eyes during a triumphal procession, you're skating dangerously close to treason. If you skip a public ritual, or get labeled as impious, you might as well paint a target on your back. In Rome, suspicion is a public sport, and the crowd is always hungry for a scapegoat. Foreign cults are tolerated only if they bring something useful: wine, gold, or soldiers. If your god doesn't pay taxes or provide backup troops, worship quietly or risk a crackdown. Roman religion isn't about what you believe, it's about what you do: ritual, precision, and timing, all performed for an audience. You don't have to feel a thing. You just have to light the candle, mutter the prayer, and smile as you offer up the goat. That's survival. And as you stagger home, half drunk on spectacle, justice, and ritual, you realize that in Rome, every day is a performance. Every citizen is an actor, and the audience is always watching, ready to cheer or condemn at a moment's notice. Speaking of performances, let's take a look at what happens when ambition, nightlife, and the relentless grind of survival collide. Because if you think the daytime is rough, just wait until you see what the Roman everyman faces after dark. So, you've made it through the sun-baked gauntlet of a Roman day, dodging lawsuits, bowing to gods you only half believe in, and somehow emerging from the public baths with all your limbs and most of your dignity intact. You might think, after all that, you've earned a break. Maybe a quiet corner, a warm meal, a little peace. But that's where you'd be wrong. Because in Rome, when the daylight fades, ambition flickers to life, and the real battle begins. Let's talk about that ambition, the driving force that keeps you climbing, even when every rung on the social ladder is greased with fish sauce and the blood of rivals. Picture Roman society as a game of snakes and ladders. Only the snakes have knives. The ladders are made of rotting wood, and every move is judged by a jury of your so-called friends and enemies. At the pinnacle, the senators preen in their wine-stained togas with purple stripes, lording over vast estates so big they need their own map. Beneath them, the equestrians, business moguls who dabble in politics and lawsuits for sport. Then there's you, somewhere in the churning sea of plebeians, elbowing for scraps and shreds of respectability. Below that, freedmen, foreigners, slaves, and the occasional luckless soul who insulted a statue one time and never lived it down. If you want to move up, and you do, because the alternative is stagnation, or worse, you'll need a patron. Think of a patron as a cross between a boss, a mobster, and a sitcom landlord. Each morning, you shuffle in with a gaggle of desperate clients for the ritual greeting, the salutatio. You stand in line, rehearsing compliments for your patron's haircut, his son's grammar, or his wife's pet peacock. If you're lucky, you get tossed a coin, maybe a stale loaf, or the honor of carrying his litter through the forum while everyone watches. Congratulations, you're now officially a client, one rung higher, but still a heartbeat away from disaster. But don't get comfortable. In Rome, you're always being watched. Your tunic must be clean, not stylish, just not covered in whatever you stepped in on the way to the forum. Your speech? Proper, but not pretentious. Your friends? Chosen with surgical precision, because one wrong word at a banquet or a single awkward glance at the wrong senator's daughter, and you'll find yourself tumbling down the ladder faster than you can say, Ave Caesar. Ambition is a dangerous look in this city. The higher you climb, the more people want to see you fall, sometimes literally. Rising too quickly, someone will whisper, someone else will plot, And before you know it, you're yesterday's news, or worse, tomorrow's cautionary tale. Networking is warfare in Rome. Gossip is a kind of currency. Marriages are less about love and more about asset consolidation. If you're lucky, your spouse's family has a decent villa and a reliable supply of garum. If not, well, there's always the hope of a strategic divorce, assuming you survive the political fallout. One bad harvest, one missed sacrifice, one jealous rival, and your entire life can unravel. You won't even hear the dagger sliding from its sheath, only feel the cold, sharp lesson of trusting the wrong person. That's the daily grind for the Roman everyman. Ambition keeps you moving, but it also paints a target on your back. And if you think nighttime brings relief, think again. The sun finally dips behind the ragged skyline, bleeding gold and red across the tiled rooftops. For just a moment, you might imagine the city takes a breath. But the moment passes, and Rome transforms. Night doesn't bring peace here. It brings a different kind of chaos, a darkness teeming with danger, noise, and the kind of desperation you can smell in the air. If you're lucky, you have a lamp or a candle, maybe even a cup of cheap wine to dull the edges. But most people have nothing but the moon, their memory of the streets, and that nagging sense that every shadow is watching. Let's talk about lighting, or rather, the lack of it. Unless you're wealthy enough to burn oil lamps all night, you're navigating alleys by touch and prayer. Torches are expensive, and even the main streets are more black pit than thoroughfare after sunset. If you trip in the dark, nobody's going to help you up. More likely, they'll relieve you of your sandals and maybe your tunic if they're feeling entrepreneurial. The vigiles, the so-called night watch, are supposed to keep order, prevent fires, and stop crime. In reality, they're a motley crew of underslept, underpaid, and often under-the-table men with a bucket and a vague sense of duty. Some are brave, most are bribable, and all are outnumbered. Criminals know this. By night, Rome belongs to thieves, pickpockets, and the occasional ex-gladiator looking for a little post-arena excitement. If you're walking alone, you're the easy mark. Doesn't matter if you're a senator or a slave. If you're not armed, fast, or invisible, you're fair game. But the real terror is fire. The insulae, those charming death traps you call apartments, are stacked stories high, built from wood, wishful thinking, and just enough stone to give you the illusion of safety. Cooking after dark. Technically illegal, but hunger doesn't care about the law. One overturned lamp, and an entire block can go up like a pyre. When fire comes, there's no warning, no drills, no organized escape. You grab your single tunic, your chamber pot, and whatever dignity you can salvage, and you bolt. If fortune smiles, you make it to the street. If not, you become another story whispered by the neighbors while watching the embers cool. If fire or thieves don't get you, the noise might. Rome at night is a cacophony, taverns overflowing with drinkers who mistake volume for wit, dice games that end in curses and blood, and processions for gods you've never heard of, parading with drums and howls until the small hours. If someone in a senator's household is unhappy, Everyone within 3 blocks is going to know about it. Sleep? That's a luxury reserved for the rich, the drunk, or the exceptionally hard of hearing. And don't forget the rats. They scurry behind your walls, their claws scratching like the world's smallest, angriest orchestra. Your neighbor coughs with the persistence of a dying goat. Somewhere, a baby wails. Somewhere else, someone screams. Pleasure, pain. It's all the same in the din. You press your face into a pillow slick with sweat, wishing for silence, for a single moment of peace. But there is no quiet in Rome, not for you. If you're a woman and you must be out at night, may the gods be with you. Rome's streets after sunset belong to the desperate, the reckless, and the dangerously bored. Unescorted women are targets, plain and simple. You keep your head down, your pace quick, and your prayers constant. Every shadow seems to reach for you. Every footstep echoes with a threat. And yet, somehow, life continues. When the dawn finally claws its way over the horizon, you're left with the remains of another night survived. You woke in a crumbling insula, braved public toilets with their communal sponge, yes, that infamous communal sponge, which never gets any less horrifying, no matter how many centuries you endure it. You navigated chariot traffic, sidestepped gladiator gore, breathed in more lead than is strictly healthy, and endured leeches, religious festivals, and burning rooftops. You ate lentils, drowned in fermented fish sauce, bowed to gods who never answer, and tried to sleep through riots, rats, and the occasional public beheading. By sunrise, you're dirty, exhausted, maybe infected, and certainly traumatized by things that would send a modern human running for the nearest shower and therapy appointment. And that's only one day. Would you survive another? Let's be honest. Most people today wouldn't last until lunch. Take away your air conditioning, your antibiotics, your endless stream of delivery pizza, and you'd crumble faster than a poorly built insula. You'd surrender before the second round of garum. But here's the thing. The Romans did it. Day after day, year after year, for centuries. In the midst of filth, brutality, and an unrelenting noise that makes Times Square on New Year's Eve look like a meditation retreat, they built a world. They constructed cities, roads, aqueducts, libraries, temples, amphitheaters. They expanded their reach across continents, administered laws, mapped the stars, developed philosophy, performed surgeries, and invented concrete that's still standing when modern buildings are already falling apart. Their systems shaped Europe and far beyond for 2,000 years. Latin seeded half the languages you hear today. Their political ideas, republics, senates, veto power, echo in every modern democracy. Their architecture inspired cathedrals, parliaments, and college campuses everywhere. But every bit of that came at a cost. For the Roman everyman, the real backbone of the empire, daily life was a relentless, grinding struggle. And yet they endured. They adapted. They survived, not out of some romantic sense of destiny, but because survival was the only option. Rome was never made of gold, not where it mattered. It was built from sweat, fear, ambition, and the sheer will to keep going. layer by layer, person by person, century after bloody, sleepless century. That's why it lasted long after you'd have begged for a hot shower and a mattress softer than a marble slab. And that's all right. You don't have to survive ancient Rome. You just have to understand it. Maybe, with a little perspective, you'll appreciate your plumbing, your antihistamines, and that sweet, sweet privacy you get with a modern toilet. Somewhere, sometime, someone walked these filthy, noisy, dangerous streets and helped build the world you live in now. So the next time you complain about your Wi-Fi or your neighbor's barking dog, remember, you could have been waking up in Rome, clutching your chamber pot, praying your building doesn't collapse, and wondering if the communal sponge is ever truly clean. But if you think Roman life was tough, wait until you hear about the women who refused to accept their lot. Our story now turns to the 2nd century BCE, where Rodigon's vow sparked a rebellion that shook an empire. Step into the sandals of a Parthian princess in the 2nd century before the Common Era, if you can call them sandals. More like dust-caked leather flaps, really, because this is not the polished marble world of Roman senators or silk-draped Greek courtesans. No, you're Rodigon, and your childhood smells like sweat-soaked cavalry tents and the ever-present tang of fear that your next meal might be laced with something more than honey. Royalty in Parthia means less lounging on couches and more ducking from poisoned dates at state banquets. Your father, Mithrates II, wasn't some gilded idol posing for coins and basking in flattery. He was a builder of empires, a man who took a patchwork kingdom and hammered it, by treaty and by sword, into something the Romans would eventually eye with both respect and suspicion. But let's be honest, when a kingdom grows faster than a kitchen rat problem, there's bound to be trouble. Every expansion means new borders, new enemies, and, inevitably, the occasional city that decides paying taxes is a suggestion, not a requirement. Growing up in this storm, you, Rodigon, didn't have the luxury of ignorance. From the moment you could walk without tripping over your own hem, you were shadowing envoys as they bickered, watching generals sketch battle plans in dust, and learning to read the ever-changing list of which noble families were trustworthy, and which ones would sell you for a handful of silver. Forget embroidery lessons. You learned to interpret the subtle language of a commander's scowl, the warning in a servant's hurried step, and how to slip a dagger up your sleeve without wrinkling your ceremonial tunic, while the other noble girls practiced the art of the demure smile. You practiced the art of keeping your food down in the stench of a war camp. Parthian noblewomen weren't ornamental figures, paraded about in pearls and left to wither behind palace walls. Some ruled cities outright. Others brokered alliances that bent the fate of dynasties, and a rare few, like you, Rodigon, were destined not to be remembered as someone's wife, but as someone's conqueror. By the time your name began to ripple through the empire, you'd already become a living symbol. To the scribes, you were Parthian pride in flesh and bone, a reminder that nobility wasn't just inherited, it was earned, preferably by outlasting your enemies and looking them in the eye while doing it. And you weren't about to let anyone forget it. While your peers were being slathered in oils and perfumed until they resembled walking spice racks, you pored over military dispatches and debated logistics with commanders twice your age. You wore armor that pinched, bruised, and made you sweat in places you didn't know existed, and you did it without a whiff of vanity. Royal life, for you, meant that every mirror reflected not just your face, but the expectations of an empire, expectations you were determined to exceed, even if it meant there'd be more dust than gold in your hair. Then, the world tilted. A rebellion, bold enough to make the scribes drop their quills in disbelief, erupted in the empire's western reaches, likely in the hard-bitten lands of Media or Babylonia. And this wasn't your garden variety tax revolt, the kind you could squash with a sternly worded scroll and half a battalion. These rebels were aristocrats and city governors, the kind who believed their birthright was to rule, not to take orders from a capital that felt further away each passing year. They seized fortresses, silenced imperial envoys, and sent a clear message to the throne: get lost and take your imperial taxes with you. Usually, a king would dispatch some ambitious cousin with more ego than experience. But these were not usual times. And you? You were not a usual princess. Maybe it was the absence of a reliable male enforcer. Maybe it was your own stubborn refusal to sit idle. Or maybe the stars simply aligned to give you the chance you'd been sharpening yourself for. Whatever the reason, you, Rodigon, took command. Not as a shadowy presence behind a tent flap, not as a figurehead for someone else's campaign, but as the leader, the one who would put her own reputation, her own dignity, on the same anvil as the fate of the empire. You didn't just step onto the field, you made a vow. Right there, in front of your soldiers, your loyalists, and a smattering of disbelieving bureaucrats, you declared that you would not wash, comb, or otherwise tend to your hair until the rebellion was crushed. Not a single drop of water, not a flick of the comb, nothing. And before you ask, yes, this was the kind of vow that keeps palace stylists awake at night, clutching their combs and muttering prayers to the gods of detangling. But for you, it wasn't about drama or spectacle. This was a living symbol. You tied your own sense of honor, your very appearance, to the relentless grind of war. Every time a soldier saw your increasingly wild, dust-caked hair, they were reminded that the fight was far from over. The troops didn't see a pampered princess. They saw a commander who was willing to let herself become as battered and bruised as the empire itself. You embodied a stubborn, thorny resilience that didn't need a throne to announce itself, just dirt, sweat, and the kind of determination that makes enemies reconsider their odds. And what about the rebels? Imagine their surprise. They'd expected to face a general, maybe a silver-tongued negotiator. Instead, they got you, a princess galloping toward their gates, eyes blazing with fury, hair already beginning to tangle into a banner of defiance, and absolutely zero interest in the latest courtly perfumes. If you've ever wondered what it's like to weaponize your own hygiene, Rodigan was about to show you how it's done. You left the capital not in a procession of rose petals and flutes, but with cavalry at your back, and the dust of 1,000 hoofbeats clinging to your boots. There was no gold-threaded standard fluttering above your head. Your hair, becoming more unmanageable by the hour, did the job instead. In a society obsessed with appearances, you turned your own dishevelment into a rallying point. Every snarl and knot in your hair became a daily reminder. As long as this vow remains, so does the fight. the campaign was nothing short of grueling. These rebel cities weren't built on sand. They were fortified, provisioned, and led by people who had no intention of surrendering to a woman, let alone one who had made herself into a walking proclamation of unfinished business. You didn't blink. You didn't hide in the rear ranks. You rode at the front, mud splattered on your boots, armor dented from near misses, and hands calloused from gripping a sword instead of a scepter. Your tactics were sharp, honed by years of watching men twice your age outmaneuver each other in the palace. You used speed and deception, classic Parthian strategies. You'd appear at one city's walls, disappear, and then strike from an unexpected flank. The rebels never knew where you'd show up next. Your soldiers respected you not just for your lineage, but for your cunning. You didn't just give orders, you shared their rations, inspected their gear, and took patrols through the same muddy fields they slogged through every night. As the weeks dragged on, your vow became its own legend. By the third month, your hair was a battlefield all its own, ropes matted with dust, knotted with sweat, and carrying the silent prayers of every soldier who'd watched you ride out at dawn. The rebels, unnerved by your refusal to play by the rules, began to call you the Witch Queen. Not because you had any supernatural powers, but because what noblewoman in her right mind would refuse a bath for this long? Clearly, they whispered, something unnatural was at work. But there was nothing magical about you, just the kind of discipline that makes even seasoned commanders shudder. When at last you reached the final rebel stronghold, a city so heavily fortified its walls looked more like mountains than masonry. The legend had outpaced the rebellion itself. Soldiers in both camps grumbled that you'd never wash again, and more than one rebel was convinced your hair was turning to iron. If you ever wanted to launch a line of battle-hardened hair products, this would have been your moment. Your approach to the siege was cold and methodical. No rash charges, no desperate assaults. Instead, you choked the city slowly, cut off trade, intercepted messengers, and let time itself do the work. The rebels had expected a sword fight. Instead, they got famine and despair. You camped with your soldiers beneath threadbare tents, shared their stale bread and sour wine, and refused, day after day, to so much as look at a comb. The vow had become sacred, untouchable. No one dared joke about it. Every tangled strand was a silent message. We suffer together, and we will endure together. Inside the city, things crumbled. Supplies ran low. Commanders bickered. Rumors whispered through the streets like rats in the dark. Some said the empire had already fallen, others that you'd never stop until every rebel was dust. And then the break came. One night, a gate left unguarded for an hour, perhaps due to exhaustion, maybe a traitor's hand, was discovered by your scouts. Under the cover of darkness and a wind that seemed to carry the scent of victory, your soldiers slipped inside. By dawn, the city belonged to you. No trumpets, no parade, just you, standing on the battered walls, hair streaming wild and unwashed in the morning sun, a living banner of what it meant to endure. Victory wasn't announced with a feast or a gilded decree. It was announced with water. For the first time in months, you summoned your attendants, not to the velvet-draped privacy of a royal chamber, but out in the open, in front of the soldiers who'd marched and bled beside you. Basins were filled, oils warmed, combs brought out like revered artifacts. Under that wide, cloudless sky, you, Rodigon, the woman who had outlasted a rebellion and every expectation of her rank, let the water run through your hair. Each tangle undone was a province reclaimed, each rinse washed away not just sweat and blood, but months of defiance and hardship, soaking into the earth as if the land itself needed cleansing. Some say you wept, others claim you laughed. Either way, no one present ever forgot the sight. Hardened men, faces marked by war and sun, fell silent as you emerged from the ritual transformed. No crown needed, your dust-caked hair had become your diadem. The act of not washing had become more powerful than any jewel, more enduring than any scribe's ode. In that moment, the Pathian Empire didn't just have a princess. It had a legend. You could have ridden straight to the capital, let the court flatter you with gold and flattery, allowed your name to be sung in the marble halls by trembling nobles. But you remained in the field a while longer. You dined with your men, listened to their stories, and made it clear your legend would not be forged in luxury, but in memory, shared, lived, and earned on the same ground as those who followed you. And so, as the last suds of war slid down the drain, and Rodigon's vow finally washed into history, you might think the story ends here. But, as you'll see in the next chapter, the legend was only just beginning. After the hair washing that became an event for the ages, Rodigon could have ridden straight to the capital with fanfare, banners, and enough propaganda to last a century. You've survived the battle, the mud, the hunger, and the stink. Victory is supposed to taste sweet. But let's be honest, nothing in Pathia ever tasted much sweeter than watered-down wine and a chunk of stale barley bread. Still, in the weeks following Rodigon's infamous cleansing, the entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. She could have paraded straight into the capital, soaking up the cheers, letting the court poets sharpen their pens, and the royal crafters polish her image for the ages. But that was not Rodigon's style, and it's certainly not what left her legend echoing centuries later. No, she took the long way home, always the hard road, never the easy one. I remember it well. Dust still clinging to my boots, the smell of campfires and sweat mixed with the sharp tang of anticipation. Rodigon stopped in each city she'd reclaimed. She walked the battered streets, pausing at shattered gates and market stalls, her gaze sweeping over the faces of people who had lived through rebellion and siege. She didn't just review the troops. She spoke to the stonecutters, the bakers, and the women patching up walls with mud and scraps. You could see the calculation in her eyes, which streets could be fortified, which wells needed repair, who still harbored a spark of defiance. Forget the pageantry. This was survival management at its finest. She knew that victory is a brittle thing. Empires rot from inside, not just from defeat, but from forgetting why they even bothered to fight. Rodigon wanted every citizen, loyalist or rebel, merchant or beggar, to understand that Pathian strength wasn't just chariots and coin. It was her. In all her battered, unvarnished glory. She could have draped herself in silk and demanded tribute. Instead, she asked for ledgers, listened to complaints, and yes, paid for supplies from her own battered purse. When a city held out against the rebels, she rewarded it. When a town begged for mercy, she looked them in the eye and decided, was this repentance or just fear? Clemency came, but only if she saw a future in it. By the time she finally approached the royal court, her story had already grown legs. Scribes were elbowing each other to catch every detail. Artists bickered over the right way to capture her. Should they immortalize her wild, tangled hair, or paint her as a glowing, fresh-faced heroine? Ministers whispered behind their hands, the air thick with anxiety. What do you do with a woman who wins wars without a crown? Some wanted to marry her off, as if that would wrangle her power. Others lobbied to shunt her to some distant border, hoping the periphery would swallow her up. But Rodigan? She didn't care for titles. She'd made her point. Her battlefield was her throne. The dust on her skin was her coronation, and her name had already been etched in the minds of soldiers and citizens alike. No inscription required. I saw it in the way people watched her, not with fear, but with a sort of wary respect. Rodigon never needed a ceremony. She was crowned by the struggle itself, by hardship, by the kind of loyalty you can't buy with gold or command by decree. In the months that followed, she didn't chase the limelight, but the limelight, like a hungry stray dog, followed her anyway. Her name slipped into poetry, into the songs of street performers, into the gossip of market stalls and the awe of soldiers returning home. Not because she demanded it, but because she'd earned it, one hard mile at a time. Every veteran who returned with a tale embroidered the story further. Each retelling made her myth larger, rougher, more impossible to ignore. Yet inside the palace, where ambition was always 2 steps ahead of loyalty, her silence made the powerful uneasy. She didn't brag. She didn't angle for lands or titles. Instead, she paced the corridors, listening, always observing. It was as if she understood the real battles had simply switched fields, from muddy roads to shadowy hallways. Even the king, her father, or maybe her brother, depending on which set of chroniclers you trust, had to think twice before crossing her. Rodigon wasn't just popular. She was respected, and not for her looks or her lineage, but for what she'd done. She kept her vow, and proved that Pathian might didn't belong solely to men. It could be found in a woman with tangled hair and a stubborn streak wider than the Tiber. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was a weapon. I watched as her quiet presence forced generals to hesitate, ministers to second-guess themselves. One look from Rodigan could freeze a policy in its tracks. She'd discovered the secret power of saying nothing at all. So she waited, her hair newly braided, not with jewels, but with hard-earned memory. Her very existence was a challenge to every tradition in the kingdom. She'd shown that you could lead an army without ever donning a crown. And the court, with all its silks and whispers, simply didn't know what to do with her. The years rolled on. The chroniclers, always eager to polish the reputations of kings and dynasties, began to let her story slip through the cracks. No grand mausoleum rose in her honor. No state-commissioned epics sang her name from golden scrolls. She became a footnote, a rumor. But out in the provinces, in towns she'd saved and villages she'd spared, her name remained a talisman. Mothers told her story to their daughters, not as a bedtime fairy tale, but as a warning to anyone who thought a woman couldn't change the world. Soldiers recited her tactics as if they were sacred scripture. Even the rebels, decades later, still muttered her name, as though she might ride again from the dust, hair flying like the world's most unruly banner. There's something unsettling about someone who smashes every rule and lives to tell the tale. Rodigon never settled for the role of ornamental princess. She didn't waste her days painting birds or perfecting the art of being politely ignored. She blazed through her era like a comet, then vanished just as quickly. No one can quite agree on what happened next. Some whisper she retired into peaceful obscurity. Others say she remained a shadowy advisor, steering the kingdom from behind thick curtains. The romantics prefer to believe she rode out one last time to resolve a border squabble and simply disappeared into the horizon, leaving only dust and rumor in her wake. What's certain is that her legacy endured where it mattered, among the people, in their stories, in the way they remembered leadership. She never wore the crown, but she shaped what it meant to rule. She redefined loyalty, proving that a simple promise, no matter how odd, could inspire more than 1,000 royal decrees. Even if the scribes ignored her, the dust of Parthia never forgot. Legends don't need marble statues. They need memory, and Rodigon's memory clung to the land like the ever-present grit beneath your sandals. Generations later, her story is still a paradox. She's everywhere and nowhere. No towering monument bears her image. No royal tomb boasts her name in gilded letters. But for anyone who's ever had to claw their way through mud and expectation, she's a touchstone. Not remembered like a king, but like a storm. Something elemental, impossible to contain. She didn't conquer distant lands or make peace with foreign emperors. What she conquered was expectation. In a world where women were supposed to hide behind curtains while men wrote history in blood, Rodigon tore down the curtains and marched out, barefoot, helmet in hand. She didn't wait for permission. She seized command, and the world didn't end. In fact, the world followed her. She showed her people that real loyalty isn't born from fear. It's born from watching your leader suffer with you, from seeing them choose duty over comfort, from watching them keep a vow when everyone else would have broken. She wasn't perfect. No real legend is. But that's exactly why she sticks in the mind. Her story wasn't neat or perfumed. It was tangled, raw, and honest, like her hair, like the land she fought for. And when her soldiers looked at her, they didn't see royalty. They saw someone who believed in the cause more than her own vanity. That's the part history can't erase, no matter how hard it tries. Even after Parthia crumbled, even when the palaces had collapsed and the cities had blown away on the wind, her name would return whenever someone needed courage. Artists tried to revive her in paint and clay. Writers scoured the ruins for a trace of her footprints. Her vow to not wash until she had won sounds ridiculous, until you've tasted the dust of defeat yourself. Rodigon was never about glamour or glory. She was about grit. And in the end, it was the dust that crowned her, not gold. Dust. The same stuff emperors tried to escape with their marble tombs and their pomp. She wore it like a badge. Forgotten by kings, erased by chroniclers, but immortal in memory. That's where true legends live, not in the marble, but in the earth. So, next time you're tempted to complain about your minor inconveniences, no espresso machine, no indoor plumbing, no Wi-Fi, remember Rodigon, crowned by dust, remembered by the stubborn, and still riding through history's back alleys, hair wild and head unbowed. And as the dust finally settles on her story, the question remains, what comes after a legend has burned so bright? The answer, as always in history, is that another story begins to stir. Another name rises from the sand, ready to challenge the world. And that, my fellow time travelers, is how history never really ends. Speaking of beginnings, let's step back, way back, before empires clashed and blood-soaked the sand, before her name echoed through the palaces of kings and the nightmares of emperors. Thomius was nothing more and nothing less than a wild child of the steppe, shaped by wind, grit, and the kind of hunger you only know when survival is your only inheritance. Imagine it now, the endless grasslands stretching in every direction. No marble columns, no bustling markets, just raw sky and biting wind. This was not some storybook cradle of civilization, but the territory of the Massagettai, a people who lived by the bow, the horse, and the old unyielding rules of the open world. The only thing gilded here was the sun, and it burned everyone equally. You, in Thomius's place, would have tasted dust and adrenaline before you ever tasted honey. Childhood meant learning the language of hooves and arrows, not lullabies. If you couldn't ride bareback by the time you lost your first tooth, you'd better hope you could at least hit a target at a dead sprint. Among the Massagettai, girls were never hidden away or muffled behind veils. They grew up sparring with their brothers, outpacing the boys, and sleeping with blades under their blankets. There was no room for softness, not when the next raid might come before dawn. Leadership among the Massagettai was not a birthright. It was a blood sport. If you wanted to rule, you had to prove you could bleed and keep standing. Thomius did just that. Some say she first drew blood for her people as little more than a teenager, her hands steady even when her heart hammered like thunder in her chest. The tribe she belonged to didn't pray for peace. They prepared for battle. Their gods lived in the sky and the sun, watching as they drove their herds across the endless plains. When a Massagettai died, weapons went into the grave with them, because even the afterlife was assumed to be less forgiving than the world above. Forget cities or treasure houses. The Massagettai measured wealth in horses, pride, and scars. And when enemies approached, they didn't bother with negotiations or grand speeches. They reached for bows, mounting up to meet death head on. Thomius would have learned young that mercy was a luxury and pride was as vital as water. According to the whispers that survive, Thomius came to power after the death of her husband, a man who may have once led the tribe. But here's the thing. Power didn't trickle down to her in a neat ceremonial handoff. She had to take it as anyone would who wanted to carve their place in the world. In a time when women were often traded like livestock or locked away as afterthoughts, Tomius did the unthinkable. She didn't just lead. She negotiated with kings, commanded warriors, and, when the occasion called for it, made her equals kneel. Titles meant little on the steppe, but the word for her was shahut, a checkmate in human form. She wore bronze and leather, not silk and gold, and she was about to meet the greatest empire on earth head-on. But power, especially for a woman, came with enemies. Some wore faces she knew, others watched from afar. And as Tomius gathered her strength, far to the south, another force was gathering. His name was Cyrus. Cyrus the Great, King of Kings, builder of the Achaemenid Empire, a man who could turn cities to dust with a glance, and whose armies moved like a living storm. He'd already swallowed Lydia and Babylon, stamping his mark across continents. But ambition, as I've learned after a few dozen lifetimes, is never satisfied. Cyrus looked toward the steppe and saw not a people, but a prize. The Massagetae were light on gold and heavy on pride, but they held the northeast frontier. To Cyrus, that meant access, trade, horses, and a buffer zone between him and the unknown. Yet, what really got under Cyrus's regal skin wasn't the territory. It was the audacity of a tribe, led by a woman no less, who believed they could stand on their own terms. In the cold calculus of empires, pride is an itch that must be scratched or snuffed out. But Cyrus, no stranger to cunning, decided not to rush into bloodshed. Instead, he tried a tactic older than war itself, diplomacy wrapped in velvet, sharp as a dagger. He sent envoys to Tomius, offering her marriage. On paper, it was a match made in the heavens, the Persian sun and the steppe wind, united in power. But Tomius wasn't fooled for a second. She saw the proposal for what it was, a velvet shroud for conquest. An alliance would mean her tribe was swallowed, their fierce independence smothered under Persian silk. She refused, with a clarity that needed no translation. That rejection echoed across the mountains and into the gold-lined halls of Persepolis. Cyrus, stung but undeterred, dropped the mask of diplomacy. If he couldn't have the steppe by marriage, he'd take it by force. He ordered his legions north, across the Araxes River, a boundary both physical and symbolic. The river had always been a line in the sand, the last warning before the wild. Cyrus, of course, crossed it with all the subtlety of a battering ram. But Tomius was nobody's fool. She'd grown up reading the sky, the land, and the intentions of men who thought themselves clever. Instead of meeting the Persians head-on, she pulled her warriors back, letting Cyrus's troops march deeper and deeper into land that grew stranger with every step. The Persians, used to stone cities and irrigated fields, now found themselves wandering through endless grass, exposed to winds that could flay the skin off your bones. They came upon an abandoned camp, loaded with food and, perhaps fatally, barrels of wine. The Massagetae rarely drank, but the Persians. After a long march, the promise of wine was irresistible. It was a beautiful, brutal trap. Cyrus left a portion of his army behind in the camp, under the command of his trusted general Harpagus. Night fell, and with it any illusion of safety. Tomius's warriors struck like wolves, swift, silent, and merciless. The camp descended into chaos. The clash was short and savage. Among the Persian dead was Spargapeses, Tomius's own son, who had led the assault. Some say he was captured and, refusing to be paraded as a trophy, begged for death before taking his own life. Others claim he died fighting, sword in hand. The sources disagree, but the result was the same. News of his fate reached Tomius, and something inside her, already forged in hardship, snapped, then hardened into something unbreakable. Grief filled her like molten iron, but it wasn't the kind of grief that leaves a person hollow. It turned to rage so fierce that it became legend. Tomius sent a message to Cyrus, this time not a warning, but a promise. You want blood? I'll give you all you can swallow. She vowed to turn the plains red with Persian blood and made it clear this was no longer a political game. It was personal. Cyrus had taken her son, crossed her land, and tried to subdue her people. Now, she would return the favor in kind. Cyrus, for all his conquests and cleverness, never really understood the storm he'd unleashed. He had toppled kings and shattered empires, but he underestimated the Massagetae. He saw only scattered tribes, not a force that could move as one. He thought Tomius would react like the others he'd beaten, disorganized, desperate, easily crushed. But Tomius, raised by the wind and tempered by loss, was ready to show him what happens when the underestimated bite back. As the dawn broke, the steppe looked less like a battlefield and more like a brewing tempest. Tomius, now more than a queen, something elemental, stood at the head of her army. Her warriors painted their faces with ash, a sign of mourning, blended with the promise of vengeance. There were no speeches, no elaborate rituals, just a silent understanding. This fight wasn't about territory or tribute. This was about blood, and every Massagetae on that plain was ready to make the Persians pay. The Persians readied themselves, armored and drilled, their banners snapping in the wind. But discipline only takes you so far when the ground itself seems to rebel against you. Tomius's cavalry surged forward, a wall of muscle, hooves, and bronze. Arrows flew in dark, whistling clouds. The Massagetae didn't just attack. They enveloped, harried, and shattered. The Persians, caught between the blade and the endless grass, tried to form ranks, but the chaos of the steppe devoured their order. Tomius didn't stay behind the lines. She rode at the front, a living banner for her people. Every swing of her axe was a memory of what she'd lost. Every command she shouted was a reminder that even in a world ruled by men, a woman's wrath could redraw maps and rewrite legends. The Persians broke. Some died where they stood. Others tried to flee, only to vanish into the tall grass, never to return. And somewhere in that maelstrom, Cyrus the Great himself fell. Whether he died in the melee, cut down by an unknown hand, or was captured and executed on Tomius's orders, the result was the same. The world's most powerful king met his end at the hands of a woman he had tried to conquer. The aftermath became legend, according to Herodotus. And you know how ancient historians loved a dramatic flourish. Tomius found Cyrus's body on the field, had his head severed, and, in a gesture both grotesque and poetic, dunked it in a wineskin filled with blood. "Drink your fill," she supposedly declared, "of the blood you thirsted for." Was it truth, myth, or a little of both? Honestly, when you've seen as much as I have, you learn that legend and reality often share a tent. But the message landed. Thomius was not to be conquered, not by kings or by fate. When the smoke cleared and the grass had drunk its fill, Thomius stood victorious. She hadn't just defended her people, she'd avenged them on a scale that would echo through centuries. The shock waves of Cyrus's defeat rattled the ancient world. The Persians, desperate to save face, downplayed the disaster. But the death of their great founder was a wound that would never fully heal. Cyrus's body was eventually returned and buried in the royal tombs at Pasargadae. But the stain of humiliation lingered like a bad smell in the corridors of power. For Thomius and her people, the victory was more than just vengeance. It was a declaration, an assertion that some things, like dignity and self-rule, were worth more than life itself. She had stood against the world's mightiest ruler and won, and just like that, she vanished from the written record. No one knows what happened to her afterward. No ancient scribe bothered to record her twilight years or the names of any successors she might have chosen. It's as if, having secured her vengeance, Thomius let the wind carry her away, leaving only her legend behind. In the centuries that followed, poets and chroniclers spun her story into myth. To the Persians, her name was a curse. To the Greeks, a paradox, barbaric yet more noble than their own kings. In Central Asia, she became a ghostly queen, forever riding the wind, her sword haunted by memory. Every age found a new Thomius, a mother avenger, a wild queen, a warning to the proud, an icon of feminine strength. One thing, though, always rings true: she changed the world. Thomius didn't inherit power. She forged it in fire, loss, and unbreakable will. For one blazing moment, she proved that not every empire rises. Some fall under the hooves of those who refuse to yield. And that, as I always remind myself when standing on the edge of history, is how legends are born. But what happens to a legend when the dust settles and only stories remain? Well, that's where things really start to get interesting. Much of what we know about Thomius comes not from local massage records, but from the echoes she left behind, the myths, the rumors, the stubborn facts that survived the centuries. And in the next chapter, we'll sift through the ashes and see how her story became both a warning and a beacon for those who came after. You want to know what truly survives the centuries? It's not the crumbling palaces or the dusty scrolls. It's the stories that sink their teeth into us and refuse to let go. And Thomius, queen, warrior, mother, and myth, sank her teeth in deeper than most. If you ever find yourself wandering the wind-swept grasslands where the old steppe tribes once thundered past on horseback, you won't find monuments to her. No marble columns, no golden inscriptions, no desperate attempts at ancient PR. The only record you'll stumble across is the echo of her legend, scrawled not by her own hand, but by the Greek historian Herodotus, that self-appointed grandfather of history, who never let facts get in the way of a good cautionary tale. Picture Herodotus, quill in one hand, goblet in the other, spinning yarns for his fascinated audience about a queen who toppled an emperor. He's writing a century after Thomius's time, so every detail is second-hand, or third, or just plain invented. But that's the way with legends. Herodotus crafts Thomius into a figure of almost mythic vengeance. A woman who didn't just defeat Cyrus the Great, but humiliated him. Forget armies clashing on vast battlefields. In Herodotus's telling, it's raw, personal, and almost cinematic. Thomius, the grieving mother, outwitting the mightiest king of the age, then serving him poetic justice in the form of a wineskin filled with blood and a severed head. She stands over her conquered enemy and spits out, "Drink your fill." Now, let's pause. Was any of that real? Well, that's where historians start sharpening their knives. Some will tell you that Herodotus, ever the dramatist, dialed the story up to 11 for his Greek listeners, who loved nothing more than seeing Persian arrogance brought low. To them, Thomius was a living rebuke, the ultimate underdog who toppled the world's biggest bully. Maybe the blood-filled wineskin episode was just symbolic, a metaphor for vengeance rather than a literal act. Others argue that, embellishments aside, the core is true. Cyrus the Great really did meet his end at the hands of Thomius. But here's the kicker. None of these scholars can agree, and the closer you look, the more you realize the truth is as slippery as a fish in the Oxus River. Herodotus, for all his curiosity, filtered everything through a Greek lens. He turned the Massagetae, Thomius's people, into a kind of exotic mirror, wild and free, but also noble, the very qualities his fellow Greeks liked to imagine in themselves. In his version, Thomius isn't just a barbarian queen. She's a moral equalizer, a walking, talking critique of Persian ambition. The facts blur, the details twist, but Herodotus succeeds in one thing. He refuses to let Thomius vanish into those endless steppe winds. Thanks to him, she's not just a footnote, she's a legend, prowling the borderlands between memory and myth. And what a strange immortality that is. You don't see Thomius's face chiseled into ancient coins or carved into the lintels of ruined temples. She never ruled a walled city or issued golden decrees. Her people, the Massagetae, were nomads, riding the land's pulse rather than settling down. Their history wasn't written in stone. It was carried in the stories swapped around campfires, sung in the lamplight, whispered by warriors who remembered her as both ancestor and warning. Steppe life didn't care for archives. It cared for survival. The tribes, Massagetae, Scythians, Saka, Dahae, were master horse archers, feared for their speed and unpredictability. Try to imagine the terror of a Persian infantryman, sweating in lamellar armor as the sky darkens with arrows and a wave of riders bear down, half of them women. Yes, women. Because unlike the Greeks or Persians, the steppe tribes let women ride, hunt, command, and, when the moment called for it, lead men into battle. Thomius wasn't a fluke. She was the pinnacle of a tradition that handed power not to the oldest son, but to whoever had the courage to seize it. Archaeologists have dug up Scythian graves filled with weapons, armor, and the bones of women who died as warriors. These aren't just stories. They're facts buried in the earth. Thomius's authority came from grit, not birthright. She united fractious clans, ruled by respect, and survived by never showing fear. Out here, you didn't last long if you hesitated. You rode harder, shot straighter, and trusted no one but your horse. But because her people built no stone cities, Thomius became a kind of phantom queen, her name alive only in the words of outsiders, or in the bloodlines and battle songs of her people. To Persian chroniclers, she was a warning, to the Greeks, a marvel, and to the Massagetai, perhaps a memory, fierce and half-shadow, riding with them across the grasslands every time the wind picked up. Empires rise and fall in stone, but steppe legends travel on the air. Thomius's story, carried by riders and rumor, outlived Cyrus, outlived the Persians, and outlived even the Massagetae. The centuries rolled on. Persian kings built Persepolis. Alexander stormed east, and new empires claimed the steppe. Yet the story of Thomius kept resurfacing, never the same, always adapted to whoever needed a tale of resistance or revenge. In time, her legend grew legs of its own. She became more than a queen. She was a symbol. To some, she was the spirit of the steppe, wild, defiant, forever free. She didn't fit into any empire story. She wasn't Roman, Greek, or Persian. She was something outside all that. And that made her both dangerous and inspiring. In the medieval Islamic chronicles, her name sometimes surfaced, reshaped by new languages, but never erased. Sometimes she's praised as a just ruler, sometimes painted as a savage queen. Either way, she's a reminder that power in the hands of a woman could be glorious and terrifying. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and European painters get their hands on her story. Suddenly, Thomius appears in oil and canvas, clad in ornate armor, sword raised, standing over the lifeless body of Cyrus. In the most theatrical renditions, she's hoisting his severed head high, blood dripping, a vision of victory that's equal parts horror and triumph. Was it accurate? Of course not. Was it political? Absolutely. To those artists, Thomius was the ultimate proof that a woman could not only survive in a world built for men, she could win and make the world remember it. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Thomius's legend was resurrected in the swirling cauldron of nationalism. In places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, poets and teachers seized on her as a national hero. She became proof that Central Asian identity was ancient, proud, and fiercely feminine. Her story appeared in textbooks, her name invoked at military ceremonies, her likeness cast in bronze and stone. A queen who once rode with a bow in hand now galloped through memory, myth, and school assemblies. And here's the thing. The world still stumbles over the idea of women like Thomius. She wasn't delicate or saintly or tame. She was decisive when she needed to be, brutal when the moment demanded it, and compassionate only to those who earned it. She was resistance in its purest form. The blood of empire on her hands was as much a crown as any diadem. History, real, official, chiseled into stone history, usually remembers the empire builders, the lawgivers, the men who stamped their names on everything from coins to colosseums. Thomius did none of those things. She left behind no palaces to excavate, no tablets to decipher. And yet her name survived, not because she ruled forever, but because she refused to be erased. She is the contradiction to the usual story of women in history, not a helpmate or a footnote, but a force of destiny. Thomius didn't wait for recognition. She took it, blade in hand, with the fury of a mother scorned. You hear her name in classrooms from Central Asia to Europe, not just because she killed an emperor, but because she dared to defy him. She wasn't fighting for an empire, she was fighting for freedom, the kind you can't write into law or pin to a map. Freedom that rides with the hawks, sleeps under the stars, and refuses to kneel. Walk through the heart of modern Kazakhstan, and you'll see her statue rising over the city. Her face stares out from coins, textbooks, and patriotic murals. She's celebrated as the mother of nations, the link to a pre-Islamic, proudly nomadic past. Her legend reminds people that their history began not with submission, but with the sound of battle and the thunder of hooves. In a world still tangled by power, gender, and memory, Thomius stands as a beacon, not simply because she toppled a king, but because she showed that dignity isn't given, it's seized. Sometimes leadership is a mother's grief made unbreakable. Sometimes history is written not by the victors, but by those who refuse to disappear. So why did her name survive when so many others vanished? Because Thomius was unforgettable. Because in an age when women were supposed to fade behind the canvas of men's stories, she strode forward, sword drawn, and carved her own tale into the bones of history. Empires fall, statues crumble, but legends ride on. And somewhere, in the restless winds of the Eurasian steppe, a queen rides still, unbroken, undefeated, and impossible to forget. Now, if you're wondering what ordinary people left behind when the dust cleared, let's swap horses for honeybees. In ancient Egypt, beekeeping wasn't just a hobby. Step into the blinding sunlight of ancient Egypt, where beekeeping isn't just a pastime for oddballs with too much time on their hands. No, here, it's a full-blown state enterprise, stamped with the wax seal of the gods and overseen by priests who take honey as seriously as modern accountants take tax season. You find yourself standing in the shadow of a crumbling limestone tomb in Saqqara, its painted walls alive with scenes of men in linen kilts, tending rows of clay tubes that look more like ancient plumbing than anything you'd want near your toast. It's 2,400 years before Christ, and already the Egyptians have turned beekeeping into a science, a religion, and a minor act of acrobatic survival. You watch as workers, barefoot, sun-baked, and utterly defenseless without so much as a veil, approach horizontal clay hives stacked in neat rows. These are no quaint wooden boxes, but long cylindrical pipes fashioned from Nile mud, each one capped at both ends and ready to be carted up or down the river like cargo. When the Nile's waters finally shrink away and the riverbanks bloom with wildflowers, these hives are heaved onto boats and floated to wherever nectar is richest. It's transhumance with ancient Egyptian flair, a kind of primitive GPS system for bees. The hives drift along the Nile, following the pulse of the seasons while their keepers squint into the sunrise, hoping not to drop a single jar. Before daring to open a hive, the head beekeeper, whose job is as close to a death wish as you'll find outside of pyramid construction, kneels beside the entrance, clutching a clay pipe packed with smoldering herbs. He gently blows smoke into the hive, and you can almost taste the acrid tang in the air. The bees, momentarily lulled, settle. No protective suits here, only nerves and experience. Extraction is a slow, trembling process. Honeycombs are pried loose, and the thick amber honey oozes into waiting jars. This isn't just for sweetening bread. It's medicine. It's currency. It's the stuff of immortality, smeared on wounds or sealed into the body of a dead pharaoh. In Egypt, honey is the sweat of gods. Specifically, it's the tears of Ra, the sun god, who weeps golden drops that fall to earth and transform into bees. At least that's what the priests say. And in a civilization where myth and medicine are knotted together, you don't argue. Bees are divine couriers, flitting between mortals and the sun's blazing eye. Honey is offered in temples, poured in rituals, and traded for goods from as far away as the Levant. It's even written into the daily grind, ancient medical papyri list. Honey in hundreds of remedies, mixed with wine, herbs, or milk, to treat everything from infected wounds to stomach curses. The antibacterial powers are evident, even if no one has a microscope. Beeswax, too, is liquid gold. It's molded into cosmetics for high-ranking women, slathered onto the dead for mummification, and pressed into writing tablets for scribes. Every caste, from priest to peasant, depends on the hive. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, the beehive is not just a buzzing box of insects. It's a living emblem of cosmic order, watched over by gods as stern as any modern auditor. Here, you learn that even in the afterlife, you'll be judged for how you handle your bees. But if Egypt perfected the sacred ritual of beekeeping, Mesopotamia gave it a taste of hard-nosed bureaucracy. Leap across the arid plains to the land of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, where civilization is built on irrigation, cuneiform, and the oldest legal system known to man. Here, beekeeping isn't splashed across tomb walls, but you'll find its fingerprints in the dusty libraries of clay tablets, written in a script that looks like someone's angry at their stylus. The Mesopotamians, always obsessed with order and property, treat bees as both divine agents and legal liabilities. Their records mention bee gardens, apiaries owned by temples or royals, where honey production is tightly controlled. Honey and beeswax are prized for temple offerings, medicine, and food. But they're also big business. Lose a hive, and you might as well lose a goat. It's a blow to your economy and your standing. You thumb through the Code of Hammurabi and find, sandwiched between laws about ox theft and barley disputes, a few lines about bees. If your bees swarm into a neighbor's field and wreak havoc, you're on the hook for damages. If someone makes off with your honey, restitution is exacted, usually in silver or sweet jars. In a society where almost everything is measured in bushels of wheat, honey's legal status is its own kind of miracle. Even a bee sting could wind up as a case in front of a stern-eyed judge. But Mesopotamia is not just about rules and penalties. Some tablets whisper that bees are sacred, messengers of the gods, especially linked to Ninurta, a warlike deity with a soft spot for agriculture. Beeswax is used to seal contracts, quite literally the glue of bureaucracy, and to craft figurines for rituals. The line between paperwork and sorcery blurs. The hives themselves may be made of mud brick or woven baskets, kept on rooftops or in shaded temple gardens, away from the punishing summer sun. The design isn't as well preserved as the laws, but you can picture the quiet, dusty apiaries behind ziggurats, humming with a sense of order. In Mesopotamia, the hive is more than a source of sweets. It's a microcosm of civilization, proof that even chaos can be herded, counted, and, if necessary, taken to court. Now, hike up into the stony wilds of Anatolia, where the Hittites run their kingdom like a fortress and treat bees with a reverence bordering on obsession. Here, beekeeping is woven into religion, not just economy. The air is sharp and cool, the terrain rugged, and the rituals as complex as the mountain passes. Hittite texts from the 14th and 13th centuries before Christ describe the bee not as a mere honeymaker, but as an agent of purification, a creature with the power to carry away the god's wrath. You find yourself in the middle of a ritual. The priest, voice trembling, calls out to a captive bee, asking it to take away impurity and evil. The bee is released, not crushed, an act of mercy that feels oddly modern. Honey is poured in libations, burned on altars, and mixed with wine or grain during ceremonies. The bee is a bridge between mortals and the divine, a courier of intentions and prayers. The Hittites may have used portable hives, clay tubes, or woven baskets, possibly insulated with mud, stacked near temples where both priests and beekeepers answer to the gods and the king alike. For the Hittites, honey is prized, but not just for its taste. It's a diplomatic tool, a healing balm, an offering to spirits. The bee, so tiny and easily crushed, is instead honored as a symbol of purity and cosmic balance. Hittite texts even describe bee migration, tracking the seasonal movement of swarms with a precision that rivals any modern field guide. The buzzing in Anatolia isn't just noise. It's the soundtrack of a kingdom obsessed with the interplay of nature, spirit, and survival. Now, cross the Aegean to ancient Greece, where beekeeping takes on a new flavor, equal parts philosophy, science, and myth. The Greeks don't just observe bees, they practically worship them, modeling their society on the hive's mysterious order. You wake to the cool dawn on a hillside dotted with terracotta hives, each with a removable lid and sections that let you peek inside without demolishing the colony. It's a far cry from the fixed tubes of Egypt or Anatolia. Here, the hive is designed for efficiency and repeated harvests. Greek beekeepers are nothing if not inventive. They wield ceramic bellows and clay smokers, sending gentle puffs of smoke into the hive entrance to calm the bees. The innovation is simple, yet transformative, making honey collection less like a battle and more like a negotiation. The result? Multiple harvests in a season and a thriving population of bees, all without the beekeeper ending up as a pincushion. But the Greeks are never content with just doing. they must also know why. Aristotle, the great polymath, spends years crouched beside hives, observing, scribbling, and occasionally getting stung. In his History of Animals, he notes that bees seem to have distinct jobs. Some gather nectar, some guard the entrance, and one large bee, the so-called king, leads the way. He gets the gender wrong, but you have to give him points for effort. Aristotle's work lays the foundation for centuries of bee scholarship, his errors outnumbered only by his insights. Greek honey is everywhere. It flavors wine, sweetens cakes, and preserves fruit for the lean months. It's a staple in medicine, especially for wounds, and the Greeks believed the gods themselves dine on honey-laced ambrosia. The bee is sacred to Artemis, goddess of wild places, and Demeter, the bringer of harvests. Some priestesses of Artemis even take the name Melissa, meaning bee, a feminine force buzzing at the heart of Greek spirituality. For the Greeks, the hive is a metaphor for the ideal city-state, each member with their place, working for the common good, guided by unseen laws that echo the logic of the cosmos. To study bees is to glimpse the mind of the gods, or at least the workings of nature at its most precise and mysterious. If the Greeks approach beekeeping with awe, the Romans tackle it with ambition. In the Roman Empire, the hive isn't a curiosity, it's an industry. From the vineyards of Gaul to the olive groves of Hispania, you find hives of every shape: hollow logs, cork bark containers, clay tubes, and woven baskets daubed with mud. Or, if you're unlucky, dung. Each region adapts the hive to its climate, insulating against frost in the north and ventilating against the stifling heat in the south. Roman writers like Varro and Columella, who clearly never had to scrape bee stings out of their own faces, write treatises filled with advice on hive construction, honey extraction, and swarm management. They describe the use of clay pots stuffed with thyme or oregano, the smoke curling into the entrance to pacify the bees and perhaps even flavor the honey. Iron knives flash in the sunlight as comb is sliced free and the amber honey is strained and collected. Beeswax is melted and poured into molds for candles, writing tablets, and even to waterproof ships. The Romans, never ones for half measures, find a use for every drop. Honey courses through Roman life. It's mixed into wine to make mulsum, drizzled on cakes, used in sauces for fish and fowl, and carried by athletes and soldiers as a quick source of energy on the march. Roman doctors, following the teachings of Hippocrates, prescribe honey for sore throats, wounds, and fevers. The antibacterial magic is understood in practice, if not in theory. But it's the Roman sense of order that truly leaves its mark. Large estates run by slave labor under the gimlet eye of estate managers maintain vast apiaries, their output tracked in wax tablets and surplus honey sold in markets or shipped to distant provinces. The hive becomes a symbol of Roman efficiency, organized, productive, and profitable. Bees are not just insects, they are citizens of the empire, expected to work hard and produce or risk the wrath of the overseer. In every corner of the ancient world, from Egypt's sacred clay tubes to Rome's commercial hives, beekeeping is survival, faith, and ingenuity rolled into one sticky, buzzing package. You can forget about protective gear, modern medicine, or even basic comfort. In these worlds, You face swarms and stings with nothing but smoke and stubbornness, and you learn, sometimes the hard way, that even the smallest creature can shape the fate of empires. And if you're thinking you could handle it, just remember, there's no honey bear squeeze bottle, no antihistamine, and definitely no privacy. You'd crumble faster than a honeycomb in a sandstorm. But as much as the ancients prized honey for its taste and utility, they also saw the hive as a mystical place, a living link to the divine, to healing, and to the mysteries that outlasted even the greatest empires. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Step into the ancient world, and you'll find that bees weren't just the background hum at the edge of daily life. No, to our ancestors, those little striped workers zipped straight through the fabric of the mundane and the divine, ferrying secrets from the gods and dispensing gifts that seemed almost supernatural. I can tell you, having dodged my share of angry swarms and watched more than one priestess mumble prayers over a hive, bees have always been more than mere insects. They were the messengers, the intermediaries, the bringers of medicine and miracles, sometimes whether you wanted them or not. Let's start where sun-baked sand meets myth. In Egypt, the story went that Ra, the blazing sun god himself, wept tears of pure power. When those tears struck earth, they didn't just soak into the dust. They transformed, wriggling and buzzing, into living bees. Imagine that. Sunlight and sorrow turned into tiny golden creatures. Honey, naturally, became an offering, not just for the palate, but for the gods, carried into tombs as sustenance for the dead on their long journey. The bee wasn't just a symbol, it was a royal credential. Pharaohs wore the title, he of the sedge and the bee, as if to say, I rule, because I, too, am of the hive, connected to the cosmic order. Cross the Mediterranean, and you'd find Greek society just as enthralled. There, bees pulsed with a different kind of energy, a distinctly feminine power. The priestesses of Demeter and Artemis, protectors of fertility and the wild, earned the name Melissae, literally, the bees. These women were believed to channel messages from deities, their dances and murmured chants echoing the hive's own frenetic order. The oracle at Delphi, that smoky, cryptic center of prophecy, was sometimes said to have begun under the guardianship of bee priestesses. Even the Pythia, the famous Delphic oracle herself, was called the Delphic bee. And if you ever watched a Greek philosopher trying to draw parallels between the hive and the perfect city-state, you'd notice the admiration in their voices, a society run on discipline, self-sacrifice, and collective purpose. The Stoics, who could out-stoic a stone, tipped their hats to the bee's unwavering sense of duty. Early Christians, always on the lookout for new symbols, seized on the bee too. It became a sign of chastity and resurrection, a creature that labors and creates without lust. In the shadowed courtyards of Mesopotamia, bees had yet another role. Rituals involved these insects as literal purifiers. During some Hittite ceremonies, a live bee was released after it was believed to have absorbed the community's sins. Picture that, your misdeeds, all your embarrassing mistakes, loaded onto a single buzzing body. then set free to carry them away. Honey and wax weren't just sweeteners and sealants. They were burnt in sacred fires, molded into amulets, and crammed into magical texts for blessings and healing. The bee wasn't simply an allegory. It was a real living bridge, an inhabitant of the hidden places, a maker of golden food that required no violence, a stinger only when absolutely necessary. To the ancient imagination, bees were nothing short of mystical. But if you think the magic stopped at the altar, think again. Honey was more than a treat in the ancient world. It was divine medicine. Long before anyone could name a bacterium, people knew honey cleaned wounds, calmed coughs, and kept decay at bay. It wasn't just superstition, though it certainly felt magical to the desperate and the dying. It was chemistry, centuries ahead of its own understanding. In Egypt, honey was nothing less than a healing cornerstone. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical tome older than most empires, lists honey in over 500 prescriptions. Doctors mixed it with milk or figs or garlic, concocting pastes and potions for everything from eye infections to digestive distress. For burns and cuts, honey mixed with animal fat or resin was slathered on, speeding healing and warding off rot. They'd noticed, long before microscopes, that wounds treated with honey resisted infection and healed faster. Turns out, honey's acidity and natural hydrogen peroxide did the heavy lifting. Though if you suggested it was just science, you'd get some very skeptical looks. Travel to Greece, and you'd find Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, writing out honey prescriptions for coughs, ulcers, and sheer exhaustion. He'd whip up a tonic called oxymel, blending honey and vinegar into a sour-sweet potion meant to clear phlegm and reduce fevers. Even Olympic athletes, those ancient celebrities, would gulp down honey water before a race, convinced it restored strength faster than wine or plain water. If you think modern energy drinks are new, try honey mixed with a little ancient bravado. In India, the Ayurvedic tradition classified honey, madhu, by taste, origin, and healing power. Medical texts warned not to heat honey too much, but praised it for easing indigestion, colds, wounds, and even poisoning. Honey was both medicine and sacrament, dripped into ritual fires and consumed during sacred fasts, promising both bodily and spiritual purification. Rome, never one to be left behind, had Pliny the Elder documenting dozens of honey-based cures. Honey formed the base for ointments, gargles, laxatives, and battlefield poultices. Wounds were dressed with honey to reduce swelling and infection. If you needed to sedate someone, honey and poppy juice would do the trick. Beeswax, too, had its healing uses, soft and pliable, resistant to rot. It became the base for plasters, balms, and even the occasional dental filling. Not exactly a spa day, but you took what you could get. For all its sweetness, honey was a matter of survival. It healed the sick, preserved the dead, and stood as a symbol of purity. It was the god's own pharmacy, delivered on wings you could barely see. Now, don't imagine the ancient beekeeper as a simple peasant with a stick. These folks were innovators, engineers, and obsessive students of nature. Across the centuries and civilizations, ancient beekeepers crafted tools and techniques that would shape the very future of agriculture. The design of the hive itself was revolutionary. Egyptians stacked horizontal clay tubes, terracotta pipes, really, just the right size for a thriving colony. These hives were sturdy, portable, and mimicked the bees' favorite natural nooks. The Greeks and Romans, never ones to ignore a good idea, built their own hives from clay or woven baskets, some with removable lids so you could harvest honey without slaughtering your entire workforce. This was game-changing. No longer did you have to destroy the hive to get the honey. You could open, inspect, and take only what you needed, leaving the colony to recover and rebuild. That kind of sustainable thinking put food on the table and wax in the candle year after year. But getting the honey out was only half the battle. Bees are, after all, famously defensive about their treasure. To calm them, beekeepers mastered the art of smoke. The Greeks invented clever clay smokers and bellows, blasting smoke into the hive entrance. This trick masked the alarm scent bees released, making them less likely to attack. Romans took it a step further, burning fragrant herbs, thyme, oregano, and the like, to soothe the bees and, as a side effect, maybe add a hint of flavor to the honey. Harvest tools ran the gamut, from wooden knives to bronze blades, each designed to slice honeycomb with minimal fuss. Sometimes the combs were pressed to squeeze out the last drop of honey. Other times, wax was melted and filtered for later use. Protective suits? Forget it. A veil, if you were lucky. More often, it was just a steady hand, a calm demeanor, and the wisdom gained from more than one painful sting. Ancient texts reveal beekeepers were meticulous observers. They learned to read the seasons, track the ebb and flow of nectar, and predict when swarms would split from the hive. Some practiced a form of migratory beekeeping, moving hives to follow the blooming of flowers, just as commercial beekeepers do today. Honey storage was another science. Egyptians sealed honey in ceramic jars, keeping it safe from moisture and spoilage. That's why archaeologists have found honey in tombs, still unspoiled after centuries. If only modern leftovers lasted as long. The relationship between humans and bees was managed with as much ritual as practicality. Offerings were made, prayers whispered, and rituals performed to keep bee spirits content. Appeasing the hive was as important as any tool or technique, because an angry colony can make you regret your career choice in a hurry. So ancient beekeeping was never just agriculture. It was a discipline that blended craftsmanship, natural science, and reverence. The methods and mindsets developed then continue to influence modern beekeeping, right down to the removable frame and the smoker. It's one of those rare ancient crafts that's still very much alive, humming along in the background of civilization. The legacy of beekeeping is far more than jars of honey on a shelf. Ancient beekeepers shaped medicine, religion, the economy, and the very way we think about sustainability. From the banks of the Nile to the olive groves of Greece, from Anatolian highlands to Roman farms, they honed methods to protect bees and harvest their bounty without destroying the delicate balance of the hive. Their respect for the life cycle of bees fostered a model of harmony between people and the natural world, a model we still struggle to live up to. Their knowledge of honey's medicinal powers laid the foundation for pharmacopoeias that would echo through the ages. Honey's natural ability to heal wounds and preserve bodies made it a cornerstone of ancient and traditional medicine. Beeswax found its way into cosmetics, art, and even early construction techniques. And the spiritual meanings attached to bees and honey have outlasted empires. Even today, rituals honoring bees persist, and the image of the hive stands as a metaphor for order, cooperation, and a blessing from something greater than ourselves. The idea of bees as messengers and symbols of resurrection runs deep in art, literature, and folklore. Migratory beekeeping, once a matter of survival, is now essential for feeding the world. Whole crops depend on the seasonal choreography set by beekeepers and their hives. Ancient innovations paved the way for our modern understanding of pollinators and the environmental crises they now face. Despite all our technological advances, the core relationship hasn't changed. We depend on bees for our food, our medicine, and the health of our ecosystems. And bees, in their own way, have shaped our cultures, economies, and mythologies since time began. The story of ancient beekeeping is a testament to human ingenuity, our capacity for respect and cooperation, and the enduring lesson that even the smallest creatures can inspire science, faith, and survival. So next time you reach for a spoonful of honey, remember, you're not just tasting sweetness. You're part of a chain that stretches back to pharaohs, priestesses, healers, and countless unnamed keepers who learned to listen to the hum of the hive. In a world that too often forgets its roots, the bee remains a tiny, tireless reminder of the power of collaboration and the cost when that collaboration falters. Think about that, and maybe, just maybe, spare a thought for the next bee you see. After all, they've been carrying messages longer than any of us have been listening.